Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's event, Taiwan, a Contested Democracy Under Threat. My name is Dave Schulman, Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, which devises allied solutions to the global challenges posed by China's rise, leveraging the Atlantic Council's work on China across our 16 programs and centers. Taiwan is central to many discussions today about the future of East Asia, global security and critical supply chains, and the US-China relationship, including the discussion held yesterday between President Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping. But Taiwan itself still remains little understood in the United States and around the world. Taiwan's population of nearly 24 million people is comprised of diverse groups ranging from indigenous Austronesian Taiwanese, transnational Hakka, immigrants from all over Southeast Asia, and different generations of Han Chinese, who all live in a hard-won liberal democratic society. Its achievements in high technology through its advanced chip manufacturing capabilities, marriage equality for the LGBTQ plus community, its response to the COVID-19 pandemic, all of these are envied in Asia and around the world. And all of this is the backdrop even as Taiwan faces constant threats to its economic and national security, as well as ongoing international marginalization due to Beijing's intensifying efforts, militarily, through aggressive diplomacy and coercion abroad, and more insidiously through information operations and political interference efforts to coerce the so-called reunification of what it considers to be a rogue province. Hub non-resident fellow Lev Nachman is one of the authors of a new book by the same name of today's event. It was his and co-author Jonathan Sullivan's goal to tell the complex story of Taiwan for new and old audiences alike. As the book's authors frame it, quote, as a top 20 global economy and tech powerhouse, a liberal democracy on the front line of authoritarian pressure, and a pivotal component in the free and open Indo-Pacific, Taiwan's future will have an outsized impact on the direction of travel for regional peace and the global order. The telling of this story couldn't happen at a more pivotal time, as Taiwan prepares for a critical presidential election in January, with a campaign that is heating up with the two main opposition parties, both of which have pledged to resume talks with China, having just this week announced a joint presidential ticket to try to dethrone the incumbent Democratic Progressive Party, signaling Taiwan's trajectory could drastically change next year. And so I'm pleased to introduce Lev Nachman, who will kick things off today by giving us a summary of the book, which will be available on November 30th, and why the conflict over Taiwan's identity is perhaps one of the most consequential issues of this century. From there, we're going to jump into a panel discussion on the book's themes and how they can be used to better understand what's at stake for the United States, for China, and for the world. Dr. Lev Nachman is a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub and an assistant professor in the College of Social Science at National Chengchi University. He was previously the Ho Family Postdoctoral Research Fellow in Taiwan Studies at the Harvard Fairbanks Center and holds his PhD in political science from the University of California, Irvine. He's based in Taipei. Lev, I'm so glad we could have you today to discuss your book and this topic. And I'm pleased to also introduce our event's moderator, Bethany Allen Ibrahimian, who we've had the privilege of having moderate previous events with us. Bethany is the China reporter at Axios, where she writes high-impact investigations, exclusives, and analysis about China, with a focus on how China projects power and influence beyond its own borders. She's also the author of an excellent book of her own, Beijing Rules: How China Weaponized Its Economy to Confront the World, which was published back in August, and I see right behind your head there, Bethany. Before joining Axios, Bethany was a staff editor and contributing reporter at Foreign Policy magazine, and later served as the lead reporter for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists China Cables Project, a major leak of classified Chinese government documents revealing the inner workings of internment camps in Xinjiang, where she received the Robert D.G. Lewis Watchdog Award. Bethany, welcome back. Thanks for joining again. We're so delighted to have you moderate today. Let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm delighted to be able to moderate this conversation with three incredible experts at this. The timing could not be more incredible. As Dave mentioned, there was just the meeting between Biden and Xi on Wednesday, and stunning announcements here in Taiwan regarding domestic politics. But first, let me hand it over to Lev, who is going to give us an overview of his excellent new book, and we will go from there. So Lev, over to you.
All right. First of all, thank you so much, Dave, for the very kind introduction. Thank you so much, Bethany, for moderating. Thank you so much, Sarah and Wendy, for taking time out of your schedules to not just read my book, but to discuss it as well. And very much thank you to the Atlantic Council Global China Hub for not just having me as a non-resident fellow, but for putting this panel together, especially Matt Geraci. I know how much time and effort was put into making this event happen, and I'm very grateful. So this book, John and I signed the contract about a month before Nancy Pelosi came to Taiwan. And boy, did we not expect that our original plan to write something for a common audience was only going to become even more needed ever since that event. If Taiwan has become anything in the world, it has become perhaps one of the most questioned places because it is not only prominent in the news, it is becoming an increasingly salient domestic topic in the United States and in many Western countries around the world. And yet Taiwan is incredibly complicated to explain to people who are completely unfamiliar with it. And for a place that is so incredibly important and yet so deeply not misunderstood, just a general lack of awareness, the need for a accessible, easy introduction to Taiwan, its history and its politics seemed so incredibly necessary. So when John approached me to co-write this with him, it was a very obvious yes. I'm not going to spend too much time talking. I'm just going to very quickly walk through the book, its contents, and why I think it might be of interest, if not to experienced Taiwan watchers, then to those who have friends who are interested in Taiwan, those who would like to learn more about Taiwan, or if you're like me, you have a mother back home who's dreadfully worried when she reads the headlines and you need to give her something to help make her feel a little bit more at ease. So to start off, our book is not an academic book. It is emphatically not meant to be jargony. It's not meant to be difficult. It is meant to be like an airport book length read. Amazon says it takes you 3 hours to read it, which I didn't even know Amazon had that kind of metric on it, but it is not meant to be a long, complicated book. With that, here is our table of contents. I'm just going to very quickly go over each of these chapters, what's in them, and how we sort of wrap up the book. So we begin with a very much an ode to my dear friend and mentor, Shelley Rigger, whose book, Why Taiwan Matters, was the original guide in English to introducing Taiwan. It's here that we explain what the Taiwan problem or the Taiwan question is and how we can understand it in very simple terms, explaining how the PRC's claims over Taiwan are emphatic, so much so that it does not matter what Taiwan does, the PRC's claims will not change. And when you are a free democracy like Taiwan, that puts your international position in a very complicated status. We spend a chapter on Taiwanese history, and any academic who studies Taiwan knows how incredibly hard it is to summarize Taiwan's history in just a few words. We only had 5,000 words per chapter, and this was actually a reoccurring theme during our writing process. A lot had to be cut because our goal was to keep this book short, so there were many actually additional sections and practically chapters that didn't make it into the end. But one of the biggest challenges was to very neatly condense Taiwan's history into just 5,000 words. Something that I'm very proud about with this book, however, is that we made sure to take special attention to include Indigenous history in our history chapter, because it's really important to us that we highlight just how complex Taiwan's demographic makeup actually is and how it has been for centuries. Our next chapter, decided by the Taiwanese people, is the story of Taiwan's domestic politics. It begins by covering Taiwan's story of democratization, but then goes into more the story of how Taiwan's domestic politics actually function. What do Taiwanese voters care about? What is the relevance of Taiwanese identity? What makes Taiwan's domestic political question, this question of its contested status and relationship with the PRC, so incredibly important during elections? How do Taiwanese elections actually work? What kind of things should you follow on, say, an election cycle like we're having right now? This is meant to be an introduction to sort of those domestic political questions. Next, we have a chapter on Taiwan and the ROC. Perhaps something that a lot of people often don't fully see is that the ROC and Taiwan are slightly separate institutions. Taiwan is the name of the island that the ROC as a political institution exists on, the Republic of China, a political institution that was brought over by the Chinese Nationalist Party, the KMT, in 1945. And how over time different leaders of Taiwan relate to the ROC has varied quite extensively. Whether you look at President Li Denghui, President Chen Shui-bian, President Ma Ying-jeou, or President Tsai Ing-wen, they have all related to the ROC in different ways, and that really sort of changes how Taiwan sees itself and sees its place in the world. And that's what we expand on in this chapter. Next, this chapter is Sacred and Inviolable. This is a chapter about the PRC's claims to Taiwan. Now, whether or not you agree or disagree with them, it's really important to understand where exactly the PRC's claims come from, because they didn't just make them up. They have them grounded in very nationalistic leanings, but they do come from certain places, and we want to make it clear to readers why exactly it is that the PRC makes such emphatic claims over Taiwan and its territory. Next, we talk about the US-Taiwan relationship, perhaps Taiwan's most important ally in the world, and how relations with the United States have changed over time. Of course, the US-Taiwan relationship is deeply intertwined with the US-China relationship, and that relationship isn't by no means spared in this chapter as well. We also spend time talking about how different countries around the world have different kinds of relationships with Taiwan as well, and the varying kinds of one China policies and one China versus the one China principle from the PRC. Next, this chapter title is taken, of course, from the very infamous Economist magazine's headline, "The Most Dangerous Place in the World." This chapter is using some of our IR tools that we have in political science to try to understand Taiwan's current status and where Taiwan might go in the future, using issues such as realism and liberalism to sort of think about how Taiwan might progress in the future. Next, we have a chapter on Taiwan's political economy, which talks about how Taiwan's economy became so fundamental in the world. We pay special attention, of course, to Taiwan's semiconductor industry, how semiconductors have become so pivotal in Taiwan, and how the Taiwanese government has invested so much into the semiconductor industry in order for it to become such a powerhouse when it comes to the importance of semiconductors, something that the entire world now pays attention to Taiwan for, especially during the COVID pandemic. Finally, we have a chapter, almost finally, we have a chapter called Taiwan's International Position, which talks about Taiwan's diplomacy practices and how it's able to conduct its own soft power around the world. And then finally, in our very last chapter, we have some thoughts about where Taiwan might be going. Now, it's no secret that political scientists are infamously bad at predicting the future. So we try to keep our predictions very light and instead give readers some ways to think about what might happen in the future. We ended, of course, with this very nice bold section here that says the post-Tsai era, which I know we are all incredibly eager to talk about, because in Taiwan, it's been an absolute bombshell of a 48 hours in terms of what exactly the post-Tsai era might look like. But we wanted to end this book in a way that allows readers to think long-term and think about what the future of Taiwan might entail. So I just wanted to end with, we also include a number of other academic sources from Taiwanese scholars that you can go and learn more about. We also include non-academic sources to try to make learning about Taiwan more fun and accessible in as many different ways as possible. And we also include a number of the English language outlets on Taiwan politics that John and I both follow very closely, just so that when you are done with this book, your knowledge of Taiwan doesn't have to stop, or your learning about Taiwan doesn't have to stop, but you can go on and find as many different kinds of sources that are helpful. Just as one final plug, the book is available on Amazon. If you would like to not buy it on Amazon, it's also available at Columbia University Press or at Barnes & Noble or at Target. And I very much hope that this is something of value for readers around the world. With Taiwan's presidential election coming up, there has never been a time more when there needs to be something that people can access in a simple and accessible way, not just for ourselves, but in order to communicate effectively what Taiwan wants for its future and how we as global watchers can better understand Taiwan. Thank you all very much for your attention. I am incredibly excited to get into the discussion.
Thank you so much, Lev. I'm also really looking forward to it. I was lucky enough to be able to attend your first book event here in Taipei a few weeks ago at New Bloom. And I just want to let the audience know that it was standing room only at his book event there. So many questions. I think it's a very timely book. I'm so happy that I was given the opportunity to read it. And I learned so much. Even it is supposed to be an introduction or a basic introduction, but I really found myself appreciating the care with which each sentence was written. And, for anyone who's ever worked on Taiwan, that it's when you're trying to write precisely about Taiwan, it's the devil is really in the details to get things right. Some of these formulations about Taiwan's history and its identity and its political status are so difficult. And I loved the care that went into that. And I think my favorite chapter was, unsurprisingly, I love history. It was the chapter about Taiwanese history. So I'm just going to take moderator's privilege really quick here and ask you a question, Lev, about the history of Taiwan. But I'm going to come at it from a certain kind of in an annoying way, which is to ask, has Taiwan been part of China since ancient times? And is it a breakaway province?
Great question. And thank you so much for the kind words, Bethany. And I'm so happy that you're able to be at two of my book events. I'm super grateful. So the question comes from like the very cliche phrase that you often hear the PRC say when it refers to Taiwan, this 自古以来, this idea of since ancient times, Taiwan has been part of the PRC. And what's interesting is that historians have spilt hundreds of thousands of pages talking about the historic claims over Taiwan. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that Taiwan has not really been part of China as we modernly conceptualize it as since ancient times. Instead, we really can sort of see its first encapsulation into sort of what we consider imperial China, actually the very last dynasty of dynastic China, the Qing dynasty. It's really just the very last dynasty that we start to see Taiwan included sort of on China's territory. Now, the story of how exactly it got brought into the Qing dynasty is a very exciting one that involves pirates and civil war and betrayal. But when it really comes down to when Taiwan was included on the map, it wasn't until much, much, much later in China's history. So, in the most generous reading, if you wanted to say if ancient times is dynastic China, then maybe you can make a very big stretch that the Qing dynasty is technically dynastic China. But when you look at it on a scale of the timeline, the rhetoric of it's been part of China forever and ever and ever, and there's this sort of kind of essentialist understanding of Taiwan's connection to China, the historical documentation doesn't really support those kinds of hypotheses.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. So I'm going to open it up to our panel now. And before I do that, I would like to remind all the members of our audience that we welcome your questions. And you can go to askac.org to submit your questions, and we will try to get to those a little bit later. Right now, I'm going to introduce our other two outstanding panelists. We have Sarah Newland, Assistant Professor of Government at Smith College. She conducts research on local governance in mainland China and Taiwan, and on subnational diplomacy between the US, China, and Taiwan. Her work has been published in Governance, Pacific Review, China Quarterly, and the Journal of Political Science Education. She's a fellow in the Public Intellectuals Program of the National Committee on US-China Relations, and a member of the US-Taiwan Next Generation Working Group. And we also have with us Wen T. Song, a non-resident fellow at the Global China Hub with the Atlantic Council. He's also a lecturer in the Australian National University's College of Asia and the Pacific, and a member of the Australian Centre on China in the World. A political scientist by training, his research focuses on the US, China, Taiwan trilateral relationship, with particular interests in Taiwanese politics, Chinese leadership tracking, and US epistemic community. Okay, let's jump right into it. What happened this week in Taiwanese politics? And Lev, I'll let you start off, and then we'll go to the other two panelists, and we'll just launch into our discussion from there.
Oh boy, where to begin? So there were two really big things that happened. First was the Biden-Xi meeting, and second was the announcement that two of the presidential candidates in Taiwan were going to form a joint ticket together. Ko Wen-je, the former mayor of Taipei, and Hou You-yi, the KMT, a former new Taipei city mayor and KMT presidential nominee. So where to begin? So the bigger bombshell was probably the domestic politics story. The reason it's such a big deal, for those who have been following Taiwan's presidential elections, you might know that Taiwan, up until this week, has had 4 presidential candidates, which is a lot of presidential candidates. Normally, there's 2. And 3 of those presidential candidates are sort of within the same political space. They're all kind of pan-blue leaning. There was only one pan-green leaning candidate from the Democratic Progressive Party, William Lai. The other 3 candidates, Terry Go, Hou You-yi, and Ko Wen-je, of course, are on sort of 3 different positions, but they're all sort of appealing to the same base of support. And all of them wanted to be president more than they wanted the DPP to lose. We know that because they were all running at the same race, even though if 2 of them had dropped out, the odds of them working together and beating the DPP would have been much higher. And William Lai has known for the last 4 months that in any 4-way race, he wins. So the attitude for him for the last few months has been to sort of kick back, not say anything too foolish or controversial, and sort of roll his way into a victory, because polling has shown that William Lai would have won any 4-way race. And it really seemed like these other 3 presidential candidates were not going to be able to overcome the collective action problem of 2 of them dropping out so that 1 person can win, and that we were actually going to have a 4-way race. But at the very last moment, 2 of them have decided that they are in fact able to collaborate. It's such a big deal because I went on the record saying they're not going to collaborate. I was convinced this was not going to happen. But then everything sort of changed a week ago when Ma Ying-jeou backed the idea. And that was really sort of a big turning point, which we can talk about later. But now we know for certain that Ko Wen-je and Hou You-yi are going to collaborate. And that completely changes the electoral calculus for William Lai. Now, we still don't know all the details, and there's still a lot of question marks. One, like who's going to be on first and who's going to be on second, Ke or Ho versus Ke. Because that will drastically change the ticket and the outcome as well. We'll find that out this weekend. There's also, of course, the small percentage at this point, but the percentage of it not going through, and there might be something that falls through. But at this point, the wedding invitations have been sent out. The engagement's been announced. It's pretty hard to put this back in the box at this point. But that was the bombshell this week, because this a lot of us have said that this has been kind of a boring presidential election in Taiwan. It doesn't have the same fire that past presidential elections have. And then all of a sudden yesterday, this just became maybe the most contentious presidential race that we've had in Taiwan. So it's suddenly a very exciting time to be here. I'll stop there and let everyone else jump in.
Sarah and Wen-ti, maybe you can chime in on anything you want to, but a question I have is, why have there been 4 presidential candidates when there's only 2? Is there some sense in the population that they're unhappy with the parties? I mean, what's the reason for this? But please feel free to jump in with your own commentary, and maybe Wen-ti, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So the question, why for presidential candidate rather than two? Well, I think it speaks to, I guess, two broad issues. First is a rise of a new political force that we've been seeing roughly since 2014, and that's sort of been brewing for a while. The other factor is the KMT, the historical opposition party's own internal fracture. So the first point, we know that in 2014, Taiwan had a what we call sunflower student movement involving a lot of protest. And that was a major social movement and political movement that galvanized a lot of young people. For many, they call it a political awakening moment for a lot of young voters in Taiwan that year, 2014. It's a kind of force that carried the DPP to the presidential election in 2016 and will help DPP won power. However, even though that movement helped DPP won power in 2016, the face of that movement, at least one of the faces of the movement, is really this guy, Ko Wen-je, who has been Taipei mayor or had been Taipei mayor for 8 years, and is currently head of the sort of the upstart third party in Taiwan politics. So he had a lot of appeal to young voters, especially young voters who historically often voted for the DPP, the ruling party. But after 7 or 8 years of continuous DPP rule, by this point, usually more change than continuity, younger voters find it just not very exciting to be supporting the DPP, which after 7 years is really establishment. Nothing exciting about that, which is why young voters historically major stronghold DPP then support the third party. And that sort of created that new electorate to justify a third candidate. And that's largely what I've been seeing at the rise of a third party in Taiwan politics, who is the third candidate this time around. And then we had the fourth candidate, Carrie Guo. As we know, he is one of the traditional KMT, that's the opposition party's political heavyweights. He fielded a run in 2019 to 2020, again for the presidency, but just fell short of winning the nomination for president from the KMT. So he tried again this year, again for the presidency, again fell just short. But Terry has enough of appeal to the opposition KMT's electorate, as well as some slight overlap with the more younger populist anti-establishment sentiment shared by the third party Ko Wen-je, in the sense that Terry represents this person who is the founder of Foxconn, the maker of iPhone, this tech billionaire who give you global connection with both the US and China almost, who also talks like a political outsider and therefore give you that excitement and energy perhaps you don't see as much from career politicians. So that's the third candidate and fourth candidate, Ko Wen-je and Terry Guo, in addition to the two traditional major parties. And that's what makes this election a very interesting and different one.
Yeah, I would just add a couple things to that. So one is I think we can think about some of these developments in Taiwan in terms of what's been happening in democracies around the world. There's really been a rise of these kind of populist anti-establishment candidates in a lot of places. I think you can think of Donald Trump as being one of those kinds of candidates. But, really a lot of people who are sort of making the claim that their citizens are disaffected with the existing political system and want an option that is a kind of outsider option. And as I think Wen-Ti's comments were pointing to, none of these candidates are true outsiders, right? Like they've all, had political aspirations or been in electoral politics for a while. But, certainly Ke kind of makes this claim that he's a surgeon. He's not, someone who has been a lifelong politician, and he's trying to kind of appeal to dissatisfaction with both the major parties. And that's something that we can see that he's really tapped into in terms of who's supporting him, right? A lot of his supporters are young people who don't really feel very represented by either political party. And so in some ways, this is like a Taiwan specific story, but in some ways, I think it's also just part of a story of, some kind of declining faith in democracy around the world, or a search for alternatives to major party candidates that's spurring the rise of kind of populist outsiders. I think I would add two other things. So I think it's important to think of this election in terms of the sort of struggles over the now fairly long term, the last three elections in the KMT around candidate selection. There has been a sort of series of problems with picking a candidate who was going to both appeal to the party elite and appeal to voters. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that the KMT's central position on China and on the relationship between China and Taiwan does not appeal to a large percentage of the Taiwanese population anymore. But I think some of it also has to do with internal party dynamics, as Wen-Ti mentioned. So, in some ways, I think it's not, I like Lev, am a little bit surprised that there does actually seem to be cooperation now happening between the TPP and the KMT. But, there was discussion from the start, from when Ho Yui was selected as the nominee. There was discussion about whether he was the right nominee, right? And whether he was really going to fully have the support of the party elite, and whether he was going to mobilize voters. And so in some ways, the fact that there has continued to be a discussion around replacing him or forming a joint ticket or things like that, that's not surprising to me. And I think the last thing I would say is just that, I think we're seeing, so Wen-Ti was talking about the fact that the DPP is now like an establishment party, that, young people no longer feel like they're voting for like outsider progressive force. They feel like the DPP is kind of the man. And so I think it's important to also just highlight the personal popularity that Tsai Ing-wen had for much of her term. Her popularity ratings are not super high now, but in the 2020 election, people voted for her at much higher rates than they voted for the DPP and the legislative side. And so I think part of what we're seeing now is she was very personally popular with voters, and people turned out to vote for her. And then that had sort of downstream effects for the DPP. And that's not happening now, right? And so what the DPP will look like in a sort of post-Tsai era, which is something actually that Lev talks about in the book, and thinking about, Tsai's legacy a little bit. So go read the book and think about that more. But I think that is, something else that's part of the story of this election, is that there doesn't seem to be that much excitement about Lai as a particular individual candidate that's going to kind of motivate young people to turn out to vote for the DPP.
Can we talk a little bit about some of the domestic issues that are being talked about in the campaign? Now, I've heard that the presidential election in Taiwan is usually that the cross-strait relationship figures in a lot, but maybe a little bit about some of the domestic issues, Sarah.
I feel like maybe I should toss this to Lev, who's actually living in Taiwan and maybe observing this to a greater degree. I mean, I can highlight a couple of things, right? I think there's economic concerns around things like wage stagnation, high housing prices, people basically feeling like they're not necessarily benefiting from some of the wealth that's coming into Taiwan through for instance, the semiconductor industry has not translated really into like rising wages for the average young person. So, I think those are the kinds of things that are sort of perennial topics on like Taiwan, political TV talk shows. But I'll let Lev maybe get into it in more detail, or Wen-Ti.
Yeah, so as I write in the book, what makes Taiwan a contested state is that its fundamental political question is not defined by typical left-right issues like we think of in the United States, but instead the fundamental political question here is, what do we do about our future, and what's our relationship with the PRC? And we know from a lot of public opinion data over a lot of years that when Taiwanese voters go into the voting booth, that is the main question they think about for their president. That doesn't mean they don't care about economics. It doesn't mean they don't care about social policy. It's just that when deciding the president, that is the fundamental issue that is cared about most. That's the most salient issue. Now, that, of course, has been discussed quite widely this election because so much of what Ko Wen-je spends his time talking about is sort of this just idea that the DPP is bad. Now, that, of course, hasn't stopped the rest of the presidential candidates from very much focusing on the question of China. The KMT leaned very heavily early on into the idea that this is a choice between war and peace, that if you vote for the KMT, we will bring you peace. If you vote for the DPP, we'll bring you war. The DPP leaned very heavily into that this is an election between democracy and autocracy. If you vote for us, we will bring you democracy. If you vote for the KMT, it will lead to autocracy. That was really sort of the frame in which China was discussed this election. So a lot of the time in presidential elections in Taiwan, the PRC is front and center, but how it's front and center can vary. So for example, in 2020, it was all about Hong Kong. In 2016, it was all about the Sunflower Movement. So this election, it seems to be much more about this idea of who's going to be able to drive the ship in the most safe way. Now, Ko Wen-je's whole shtick has been that he's above blue-green politics. But unfortunately, structurally, Taiwan is so ingrained into the question of China that one cannot simply be above blue-green politics. And even Ko Wen-je has had to come out as a pro-status quo candidate who says that Taiwan does not need formal independence because it's already independent as the ROC, but we should still maintain close relations with the PRC. He's kind of a blue-leaning KMT-esque status quo candidate. And he's had to talk way more about that ever since he became a presidential nominee. His whole "I don't talk about China" shtick has largely disappeared, which one was not really true from the beginning. He's been talking about China quite a bit over the years. You can look at, for example, his discourse on the whole Liang An Yi Jia Qin discourse, the two sides of the strait, one family, one common destiny, or his robust sister-sister relations with Taipei and Shanghai. But he himself has essentially had to start thinking about how he's going to frame himself as the next leader of Taiwan. So for example, in preparation for tonight, I was just now watching a live stream with Guanzang, Huang Guocang, and Ko Wen-je, which is especially relevant today for me because I studied the New Power Party for many, many years, and Huang Guocang officially left it today and joined Ko Wen-je's party. And Ko Wen-je was on there, and of course Guanzang, lobs him the softball of saying, why should they vote for you? And the first thing he says is, well, Taiwan is in a different place these days. Internationally, it's becoming very scary. We have war in Ukraine, we have war in Israel, but I'm not going to say this election is about war. This is about the last 8 years. The DPP really sucks. He literally says, 最近8年民进党做得很烂. Like that's his verbatim line. And then that's as much as it's talked about. So, Ko Wen-je is still going to also be using these same sort of PRC framings or at least discussions about China in the way that, as much as he tries to avoid it, when you're running for president in Taiwan, you're still going to talk about it a lot because that's still ultimately not just what voters care about, but it's also what the international community cares about quite a bit.
Wen-ti, I'd like to ask you, and again, this is for all three, but we'll start with you. The big question: what are the possible scenarios here for after the election? How might China react? What are Chinese leaders watching in this election? Do they have a candidate that they might prefer? And what would be their preferred outcome? I mean, this is obviously speculation, but analysis from this standpoint.
Right. So Beijing obviously would prefer to see broadly speaking, Beijing-friendly, Beijing dovish candidate, and Beijing is unlikely to find it on the DPP side or the pan-green side of the spectrum. And so I think what Beijing will be looking for then is to put up this good old litmus test, if you will, which candidate is going to endorse the 1992 consensus, which again is a very, very vague formula that suggests that people adhere to some understanding of one China of which Taiwan is a part. Very underdefined idea of one China, but at least if you say endorse it, Beijing feels like that give me enough lip service for me to exhibit a bit more patience. So on that so-called litmus test, you see Beijing, you see DPP candidate openly or directly says no, they do not endorse it. And for the other candidates, KMT's candidate Hou Yi endorses it, albeit with a few prefix and conditions here and there. Terry Guo endorses it as well, and the other major figure, Ko Wen-je, is interesting case, and this kind of goes back to a point Lev was making earlier about Ke's tendency to not talk about China all that much as possible. So to give you an example, when reporters ask Ko Wen-je, for example, what do you think DPP is doing on China policy? And then Ko Wen-je will say, they suck, they're stupid, DPP should be endorsing it's stupid for DPP to not endorse the 92 consensus. And then people will ask Ko Wen-je, then do you, if you become President Ke, then would you endorse 92 consensus? And to which Ke will then deflect the question. He will then be saying, but 92 consensus, this thing, it's a Beijing's idea. Beijing is trying to sell me something. They should be giving me a full manual and explaining why it is before you ask me whether I want to buy this product or not. So this is largely Ko Wen-je's brand, which is say that he's against the way things are done, i.e. he's against continuity, but he doesn't tell you what brand of change he stands for in particular. So that's, again, for many observers, one issue, one obstacle, if you will, to this Ko Wen-je and KMT unity presidential ticket negotiations before, because KMT and Ke do not agree on that major issue, that major limit test from Beijing's perspective. And I think if you look at the new 6-point agreement between Ko Wen-je and KMT from yesterday carefully, on somewhere on point 6, you will see that they somehow solved the issue, whereby they said whoever's going to be on top of the ticket, i.e. the future potential president, will be in charge of running foreign affairs, defense, and cross-strait policy. Now, there's a lot of expectation that given the way this arrangement, this agreement's done, there's a very good chance that KMT will be the one that's more likely to be on top of the ticket. So by signing that deal, Ke can then be part of the arrangement and kind of be on the good side of Beijing, but without, again, binding himself to directly endorsing nor unendorsing the 92 consensus. So in a way, it kind of works out. Strategic ambiguity may be a perennial topic in U.S.-Taiwan relations, but for Ko Wen-je, he has mastered to perfection. So maybe a lesson there for I don't know who other future potential politicians.
Yeah, I would add a little bit to that. I mean, I think probably Beijing's priority is anyone but the DPP. I think they're willing to work probably, or they would be excited to see anyone other than William Lai win. My guess is that there's some candidates who they see as more favorable to Beijing or like easier to influence than others. But I think their main priority is not having the DPP return to power. I think, one of the questions will be how, if the DPP wins, how Beijing reacts, because I think they view Lai as, in his heart of hearts, like a deeply pro-independence candidate. And I don't think that I don't think there's anything he can say. I mean, he's been very careful, I think, in this campaign season about saying basically he would continue the approach of the DPP under Tsai. I don't think there's anything he can say that will convince Beijing that he is, not a like secret independence activist, right? And so whether they respond by more of the same, right, of the kind of policies that they've targeted toward Taiwan in the last 8 years, or whether they actually sort of ratchet up the pressure, on Taiwan, whether it's militarily or through economic, means targeted, sanctions on particular products or things like that. I think that's an open question. I mean, I do think we could see some kind of retaliation in some sense if Lai is elected. But what exactly that would consist of, I think, is unknown.
The only thing I'd add to that point, something that I talk about in the book, is when we think about how the PRC has approached Tsai Ing-wen, like Sarah was saying, they don't want anyone from the DPP. From the PRC's perspective, it does not matter if you are the most pragmatic light green person or the most deep green pro-independence right now person. To them, they are the same. If you are in the DPP, you are flattened out to be the same sort of imagined independence breakaway activist, and you are damned by the PRC's standards. That's been very frustrating because, for all intents and purposes, Tsai Ing-wen is perhaps one of the most pragmatic, moderate DPP politicians out there. But because the PRC has taken this approach with, it doesn't matter, we refuse to cooperate with anyone from the DPP, we've had 8 years of no phone calls, no communication whatsoever. And by seeing her like that, it's really set up the future to be very bleak, where if Lai wins, it's essentially assumed that there's going to be just nothing more but continued silence.
We have several questions from audience members, so I'll go to those now. Here's one submitted anonymously. What sort of implications are we looking at between the difference of who's on top of the ticket, Ke or Ho?
So if I can, I'll start if that's okay. So
yeah.
I think there's been a tendency to sort of assume, looking at the public opinion polling of Ke and Ho, that we can simply add those numbers together and that's what their support would look like. And I think that's overly simplified, because who's on top is going to change that level of support. I think for a lot of grassroots sort of stalwart blue voters, they will not be happy if Ko Wen-je is at top of the ticket. I think that there's a chance that a lot of them would still defect, protest vote for Terry Go, or not vote at all if there is not a KMT presidential candidate. I cannot overstate how big of a deal it would be for the KMT to not field a presidential candidate for the first time in Taiwan. And a lot of the KMT's base of support, I think, would not necessarily stand by that ticket if Ke is in first. On the other side, I think a lot of Ko Wen-je supporters, they buy his shtick because he says he's above blue-green politics. He's now signed on to blue-green politics officially. I think that's, whether or not he's VP or P, I think there's going to be some defection. But if he's vice president especially, I think there's going to be some of his supporters who also defect. And again, I could not tell you what these numbers look like, and that should not make it sound like they're not going to still have very, very high support in the polls. They most certainly will. But I think we're going to see a lot more variation in support over time than simply adding the two numbers together. The other thing I'd add is if it's Ho Yo-ii on top of the ticket, then what we're looking at is a DPP versus KMT showdown. That's something we're very familiar with. We know what kind of the rhetoric's going to look like. We know what the election build-up's going to look like. If it's Ko Wen-je at the top of the ticket, then we're entering new territory where I think we're going to see a lot more, a very different kind of presidential race and different kinds of presidential rhetorics and attacks and debates. And it will be something different, to say the least.
I'm going to go to another question. This is from Emmett Stern. What are some ways that you expect China, through economic coercion, information operations, or other ways, to try and directly influence this election?
I'll start, and then hopefully other folks can supplement. I mean, I think disinformation is a major concern. This is something that, has been very much a topic of discussion in the last two, so the presidential election 4 years ago, but then also the local elections 2 years ago. There's clearly like a large amount of Chinese language disinformation materials that are being produced in China, and then are kind of entering the social media space in Taiwan. In some cases, those messages are then being amplified by pro-Beijing traditional media. So I think that is one sort of set of mechanisms that China clearly has been like experimenting with and developing. And, the sort of rapid development of AI obviously also potentially complicates that even further. So I think that's one set of tools. The Chinese government, I think, is has learned some lessons probably from the past. So when they've tried to use military means to influence elections, like in the before the 1996 election, they were shooting missiles into the Taiwan Strait, and voters, came out in large numbers to push back against that, to reject that, right? And so I actually don't expect to see military coercion really as an attempt to influence voters, because I think the chance of that backfiring is high.
I'll add that definitely that point about disinformation for sure, and I think there's also some room for Beijing to find ways to echo, uh, let's say Beijing those prefer framing of this election as an election primarily about choosing war or peace. It's a statement that we hear from opposition campaigns in Taiwan, and it's a statement that we hear from Beijing's Taiwan Affairs Office spokesperson numerous times before as well. So anything Beijing can do to strengthen the perceived credibility of that particular framing could potentially be a plus for Beijing's preferred candidates. One other thing is that I guess Beijing sometimes try to use their financial and personnel resources as a way to strengthen the mobilization potential and rock the vote efforts, if you will, to increase turnout for Beijing-friendly campaigns. We see that in past elections, for example, there are a lot of Taiwanese working, living, or doing business in PRC. And during election time, there were cases where PRC may have been using financial subsidies through state-owned enterprises, through some other NGO sectors, and then eventually going into the hands of local PRC-based Taiwanese business people associations, and then use that to finance, to subsidize these people to fly back to Taiwan just to vote. Because Taiwan does not allow for postal voting or non-resident voting. And with the assumption that, of course, that if you have spent lots of years in China, you have ties there, financial, personal, and whatever, you are a bit more likely to be in favor of Beijing, those-ish candidates. So these are the kind of instruments we often see from Beijing during election times.
I would just add, I guess, one more thing, which is that, Beijing, I think, tries to use economic carrots and sticks to demonstrate to people that there will be economic advantages to voting for the KMT. So, for instance, they've kind of turned off the tap of Chinese tour groups coming to Taiwan, which in some places was like a significant source of tourism revenue coming into particular cities, right? So that's something where I think the implication is that tap will perhaps remain turned off, if you vote in another DPP candidate, and if you vote for the KMT, then that money will start flowing again. So, I think those sometimes get used in local elections in pretty targeted ways to kind of reward the election of KMT mayors, and punish the election of DPP mayors. But you could see a more broad-based strategy potentially around influencing this election as well.
We just have a few minutes left, and I want to turn just for our final round through with the panelists to look at the U.S. role here. There was just the meeting between Biden and Xi. Taiwan featured prominently in their discussion. What are we seeing in the U.S. position on Taiwan, especially over the past, let's say, couple of years? And what are we expecting going forward, regardless of who wins in January, or will that affect U.S.-Taiwan ties depending on who wins?
So something I talk about in the U.S.-China, the U.S.-Taiwan relations chapter of the book is how Taiwan in the United States is a bipartisan issue, and that even though there is often this sort of common wisdom talking point that Republicans care more than Democrats, if you look at voting records, that's actually not true. Democrats and Republicans both vote down the line unanimously in favor of any sort of Taiwan policy that's ever been put to vote. So the silver lining for Taiwan is that there should be support for Taiwan, regardless of which administration in the United States wins the presidency in 2024. That being said, of course, there is some known unknowns that could happen if Donald Trump is reelected. But if Biden is reelected, then I think at the very least, we are guaranteed to have at least the similar level of robust U.S.-Taiwan relations that we've come to become accustomed to over the last couple of years. It's also been the U.S.'s position that it does not take a side in who wins in Taiwan. The United States has very good relations with both the DPP and the KMT. One of the interesting constraints, especially in Taiwan, is that every presidential candidate has to have a good relationship with the United States. All 4 presidential candidates have gone to Washington, D.C. some multiple times to do door knocks. Because the U.S.-Taiwan relationship is Taiwan's most important relationship, and that I expect that to be true regardless of who wins the next presidential election here in Taiwan. That being said, there are some candidates that I think have more familiarity with the United States than others. Ko Un-je is certainly somewhat new to, I think, the U.S.-Taiwan diplomacy. We've already even had, in less than 24 hours after his announcement, we already had a small incident where he said that AIT called him immediately, asking if Chinese influence was behind his and Ke's alliance. AIT has since sort of said that that's not entirely true, but you know, we always look forward to what Ke has to say about the U.S.-Taiwan relationship going forward. So.
And if our Sarah and Wenty, if you want to respond to that question or just have any final thoughts about what we've discussed today.
I mean, I guess I think it's unlikely that there will be any fundamental change in U.S. policy toward Taiwan as a result either of this election or of the U.S. presidential election. You know, there are some voices that are pushing for a sort of fundamental change to U.S. policy toward Taiwan, but I think they're in kind of the small minority. And I also think that structurally, there are a lot of reasons why the U.S. and Taiwan are being sort of pushed closer together in terms of unofficial ties, subnational ties. You know, there are both incentives on the U.S. side to engage with Taiwan in this moment of high U.S.-China tensions, and also obviously, you know, incentives in Taiwan, although it's contested, to engage closely with the U.S. at a moment when the Chinese military threat feels, you know, more salient than it has in the past. And so I don't really think those conditions are going to fundamentally change as a result of this election.
Yeah, I'll agree. I think with both Lev and Sarah for sure. I think over the last 2 or 3 years, one interesting development is that Taiwanese society has finally been convinced now that support for Taiwan is truly, by this point, a bipartisan issue in the U.S. Across both sides of the political aisle. And it's in that sense that even highly symbolic, some will argue potentially provocative issues, such as successive U.S. speakers from both parties meeting Taiwan's top leadership, for example, have continued to signal that it doesn't matter which party controls U.S. Congress. It doesn't really matter even which party controls the U.S. executive, with a slight asterisk, of course. Taiwan support for Taiwan will continue to be strong across both sides of politics. And I think over time, that also has a certain convergence effect on Taiwan as well. If you look at the policy statements from both DPP Lai Ching-te and KMT's Hou Yu-yi, campaign election retreat aside, if you look at the actual foreign policy writings, at least they seem to be largely falling into similar kind of template, where they all argue that primarily deterrence should be the foundation of Taiwan's management of relationship with China. And that on that basis, they will seek to find ways to diversify and manage their costs by leveraging external balancing, meaning leveraging external partners, including the U.S. first and foremost. And then only through that, only after that, is there would they start to explore possibility for quote unquote dialogue with Beijing, and that neither will be willing to be completely dictated by Beijing in terms of political preconditions for such dialogues. So I think in that sense, stronger relationship between US and Taiwan over the last few years also has a positive relations in terms of incentivizing both sides of Taiwan politics to gradually converge in their relationship with US and on China as well.
Well, that concludes our discussion for today. Thank you once again for joining us, and thank you to Sarah, Lev, and Wenty for a really interesting and informative conversation about the future of Taiwan. And do remember to go to Amazon or the other place that you mentioned, Columbia, is it Columbia Press?
Columbia University Press, Barnes and Noble,
Yes.
Target, available everywhere books are sold.
That's right, to buy your own copy of Lev and Jonathan's book. I hope you all have a wonderful day or night, depending on where you're joining us from. And thank you once again.